You tried to ignore the question. You told yourself faith means not asking, but the thought keeps coming back, late at night, when everything is quiet. What if the story isn't as certain as everyone says it is? Maybe you felt this. You sit in church, you hear the sermons, you say the prayers, but somewhere in the back of your mind, a small voice whispers, something doesn't add up. And the strange thing about doubt is this: the more someone tries to silence it, the louder it becomes. But here's the part almost nobody talks about. Millions of Christians quietly struggle with the same hidden tension. They believe, and yet, they doubt. So, the real question isn't why some people lose faith. The real question is far more unsettling. Why do so many believers secretly doubt, even while defending their faith? And once you see the answer, you can't unsee it. Because the moment you start questioning, everything changes. The thought you're not supposed to have. For many believers, doubt does not arrive with a dramatic moment or a sudden crisis. It slips in quietly, almost unnoticed at first. A verse you have read many times suddenly feels strange in a way you cannot explain. A prayer you have repeated for years seems to drift upward and dissolve into silence. A story that once felt powerful and certain now feels slightly confusing, like a puzzle piece that no longer fits where it used to. Nothing obvious has changed. The church is the same. The sermons sound familiar. The rituals continue exactly as they always have. But somewhere in the back of your mind, a small question begins to form, and it refuses to disappear. At first, the reaction is immediate. You feel guilt. Because from the very beginning, many Christians are taught something very clearly. Faith means certainty. Faith means trust. Faith means standing firm, even when you do not understand. Doubt, on the other hand, is often described as weakness, sometimes even as temptation. So when the thought appears, your instinct is not to explore it. Your instinct is to push it away. You tell yourself this is a test. You promise yourself you will not let doubt take root. Maybe you pray harder. Maybe you open the Bible again, searching for reassurance. Maybe you listen more carefully to the next sermon, hoping clarity will return. But something strange begins to happen. The more you try to silence the question, the more persistent it becomes. The mind has a peculiar habit of returning to thoughts it is told not to explore. It circles back when you least expect it. During quiet moments, during prayer, late at night when everything is still. It is like trying not to think about a particular image. The harder you push it away, the more vividly it returns. And that is the paradox many believers quietly experience. The effort to suppress doubt often strengthens it. Because the moment you start questioning, even in the smallest way, something inside your mind shifts. The certainty you once felt begins to feel less solid. And that is the moment the real conflict begins. The psychological trap of belief. Belief is rarely just an idea that lives quietly in the mind. For most people, it becomes something far deeper and more personal. It connects to identity, family, community, and the memories that shaped childhood. Faith is not simply a conclusion someone reached after examining evidence. It is often woven into the structure of a person's entire life. For many Christians, faith is present from the earliest memories. It is part of family traditions, Sunday mornings, holiday gatherings, and the voices of parents or grandparents explaining how the world works. These experiences become emotional anchors. They carry feelings of safety, belonging, and meaning. Over time, belief stops feeling like a theory about reality. It begins to feel like the ground you are standing on. Because of that, doubt does not feel like questioning a single idea. It feels like something far more destabilizing. It feels like questioning the structure that holds everything together. Imagine standing on a frozen lake in the middle of winter. For years, you believed the ice beneath you was thick and solid. You walked across it without hesitation. You trusted it completely. But one day you hear a crack somewhere beneath the surface. Suddenly, your confidence changes. The lake has not visibly broken. The ice still looks the same. Yet every step now carries a strange tension. You move more carefully. You begin wondering whether the surface beneath you is as strong as you once believed. That is what doubt often feels like inside belief. The world does not collapse immediately. Church still exists. Scripture still exists. The community is still there. Yet the sense of certainty begins to weaken. Because if one piece of the story might be wrong, a new question quietly appears in the mind. What else might be wrong too? That question can feel deeply unsettling, not because the logic itself is frightening, but because of the potential consequences. Questions can threaten relationships. They can create distance from family or community. They can challenge the sense of meaning a person has relied on for years. And that is why doubt often feels so dangerous. But the psychological mechanism behind this tension runs even deeper than most people realize. The silence no one talks about. Here is something many people eventually notice, though it is rarely discussed openly. A surprising number of Christians privately admit that they struggle with doubt at different moments in their lives. Yet very few feel comfortable saying those words out loud. Inside church settings, the atmosphere often looks completely different. People appear confident, heads nod during sermons. Conversations after the service speak about certainty, trust, and the strength of faith. Testimonies describe conviction and devotion. From the outside, it creates the impression that everyone present is standing on unshakable ground. But inside many minds, a quieter process is happening. Questions appear that are never voiced. A verse that feels difficult to reconcile. A story that seems morally complicated. A prayer that did not produce the answer someone hoped for. These thoughts do not necessarily destroy belief, but they linger in the background like unresolved puzzles. The strange part is that most people experiencing these questions assume they are alone. They look around and see confident faces. They hear words of certainty from pastors and fellow believers. Because no one is openly expressing doubt, it creates a powerful illusion. It begins to feel as if everyone else is completely sure while you are the only one quietly struggling. Psychologists sometimes describe this as a social mirror effect. People adjust what they reveal about themselves based on what they believe others expect to see. If a community values certainty, individuals naturally present certainty. If doubt seems unacceptable, it remains hidden. The result is a silent agreement that no one consciously planned. Everyone keeps their questions private. That silence then reinforces the belief that questions are rare, and that illusion helps the entire system remain stable. But occasionally, something breaks that pattern. Someone admits uncertainty. A friend confesses they have struggled with the same thoughts. A conversation reveals that others have been wrestling with similar questions all along. When that realization happens, something subtle begins to shift. The fear loosens slightly. The isolation fades. Because once you see that doubt is shared, the experience changes. And the moment you start questioning, everything changes. That realization leads to an even stranger discovery about how belief systems survive. The problem with absolute certainty. If you look closely at belief systems throughout history, an interesting pattern begins to appear. The beliefs that demand the strongest certainty from their followers often reveal an unexpected fragility beneath the surface. The more strongly a system insists that it must never be questioned, the more vulnerable it sometimes turns out to be. There is a simple reason for this. Truth rarely needs protection from questions. In fact, strong ideas usually become stronger when they are examined. Questions expose weaknesses, but they also confirm what holds up under scrutiny. Think about how science works. Scientific ideas are constantly challenged. Researchers test them, criticize them, and attempt to prove them wrong. A theory that survives repeated testing becomes more reliable precisely because it has been questioned so many times. But some belief systems operate in the opposite way. Instead of welcoming questions, they treat them as threats. Curiosity becomes something suspicious. Doubt becomes something that must be corrected quickly before it spreads. And this creates a strange paradox. If a belief collapses the moment someone begins asking questions, was that belief ever truly strong in the first place? Or was its strength simply maintained by discouraging examination? This does not automatically mean that every religious belief is false. Many ideas about morality, community, and meaning can exist alongside thoughtful questioning. But the reaction to doubt reveals something important about human psychology. People often defend certain beliefs not because they feel completely certain about them, but because uncertainty feels frightening. When a belief provides structure and meaning, the possibility that it might be wrong can feel like standing on unstable ground. As a result, protecting the belief becomes more important than examining it. Over time, this creates what could be called defensive faith. Instead of confidence built on understanding, belief becomes something guarded carefully against challenges. Questions are treated as dangers rather than opportunities to learn. Yet, this pattern did not begin with Christianity, and it does not belong to religion alone. It reflects something much older in human nature, the ancient human need for certainty. Long before modern religions were organized into institutions, humans were already searching for explanations. The ancient world was not a comfortable place to live. Storms appeared suddenly and destroyed crops. Disease spread without warning. People died young and often without understanding why. The natural world felt unpredictable and sometimes cruel. For early humans, the universe did not look like a system governed by clear scientific laws. It looked chaotic. Lightning struck the sky without explanation. Floods wiped out entire settlements. Droughts could last for months and threaten survival. In that kind of world, uncertainty was not just uncomfortable, it was terrifying. So humans did something remarkable. They began creating stories that made the chaos understandable. These stories described powerful forces behind nature, gods who controlled storms, spirits who watched over human actions, cosmic plans that gave events a deeper purpose. These beliefs did more than explain the world. They gave people a sense of structure in the middle of unpredictability. If suffering had meaning, then pain became easier to endure. If a divine plan guided events, then disasters were not random accidents, but part of a larger story. If a god was watching over the world, then life felt less like an unpredictable storm and more like a guided journey. Even when these explanations could not be proven, they offered something incredibly powerful. They offered psychological stability. Religion did not simply answer intellectual questions about the universe. It reduced anxiety about living in an uncertain world. It gave people a framework that made existence feel less chaotic and more meaningful. But this comfort comes with a hidden tension. Because the moment someone begins questioning the story, the protective structure weakens. The explanations that once made the world feel orderly begin to lose their certainty. And when that happens, something ancient returns: uncertainty. And uncertainty is one of the most uncomfortable emotions the human mind can experience. It creates tension, fear, and a deep desire to restore stability. That is why doubt often triggers such strong emotional reactions inside belief systems. But the most surprising part of this pattern is something many people never fully realize. Doubt is not the enemy of faith. Ironically, doubt may be one of the most honest responses a thinking mind can produce. Curiosity is not a flaw in human nature. It is one of its most powerful traits. The same instinct that drives people to ask questions about the universe has been responsible for some of humanity's greatest discoveries. It is the force that led to science. It inspired philosophy. It pushed explorers to cross oceans and thinkers to challenge old assumptions. Without curiosity, progress would simply stop. And curiosity naturally produces doubt. When the mind encounters something that does not fully make sense, it begins asking questions. It searches for explanations and tries to reconcile contradictions. This process is not rebellion. It is the normal function of human reasoning. Yet in many religious environments, curiosity becomes something complicated. Questions are sometimes reframed as spiritual weakness or temptation. Doubt can be portrayed as a doorway that leads away from faith. As a result, believers learn to monitor their own thoughts carefully. This creates a powerful psychological tension. On one hand, believers are encouraged to value truth. They are taught that truth matters deeply and that their faith is built upon it. On the other hand, certain questions are treated as dangerous or inappropriate. Curiosity becomes something that must stay within invisible boundaries. The mind is placed in a difficult position. Imagine a door that is being pushed from both sides at the same time. One force pushes toward understanding and exploration. The other pushes toward restraint and silence. Over time, that pressure begins to build. Some people manage to hold both sides in balance for years. They maintain belief while quietly setting aside certain questions. Others find the tension growing stronger with time. Eventually, the mind reaches a point where it cannot ignore the conflict any longer. Something inside demands clarity. Because the moment you start questioning, even gently, something shifts in the way you see belief. And that shift leads to a realization that is even deeper than doubt itself. The moment the story stops working. For some people, doubt remains small and manageable. It stays in the background like a quiet hum that never fully disappears but rarely demands attention. Life continues normally. Faith remains mostly intact, and the questions feel distant enough to ignore. But for others, something changes. Sometimes the shift begins with a historical detail that does not quite match what they were taught. Sometimes it begins with moral questions about certain passages or teachings. Other times, the trigger is much simpler. It might be years of reflection, new experiences, or exposure to ideas outside the environment they grew up in. Gradually, the familiar answers begin to feel less satisfying. Not because the person wants to abandon belief. In many cases, the opposite is true. They want the explanations to work. They want the certainty they once felt to return. But something inside the mind notices that the explanations no longer resolve the tension they once did. It feels similar to rereading a story you loved as a child. When you first encountered it, everything felt magical and complete. The characters made sense. The plot felt convincing. The world inside the story seemed perfectly coherent. Then years later you read it again. This time you noticed details that were invisible before. Small inconsistencies, questions that never receive clear answers, moments where the story suddenly feels less convincing than it once did. The story itself has not changed, but the way you see it has. That is the strange thing about awareness. Once a mind begins to notice certain patterns or contradictions, it cannot easily return to the earlier state of certainty. The questions remain present, even if someone tries to set them aside. This moment does not always lead to the loss of faith. For many people, it simply transforms how belief functions in their life. Yet it does create a new kind of tension that did not exist before. And that tension raises an uncomfortable question. If doubt is so common and so deeply human, why do so many believers continue to stay inside the system that created it? Why many doubting Christians stay? The answer is surprisingly human. Belief systems are rarely abandoned in a single dramatic moment. For most people, the process is slow and complicated, because faith is not just a collection of theological ideas. It is woven into relationships, traditions, and the structure of everyday life. Faith often means community. It means the people you grew up with, the place where your family gathers on Sunday mornings, the rituals that have marked important moments in life. Weddings, funerals, holidays, childhood memories, all of these experiences become tied to belief in ways that go far beyond doctrine. Because of this, questioning faith can feel less like changing your opinion and more like stepping away from a place that has always felt like home. For many believers, that emotional weight makes leaving extremely difficult. Even when doubts appear, the social and personal connections remain powerful. The community still provides belonging, familiarity, and shared meaning. So instead of abandoning belief entirely, many people find a middle path. They remain part of the community while quietly reshaping how they understand the ideas behind it. Certain stories are no longer treated as literal historical events, but as symbolic lessons. Teachings that once felt rigid become more flexible interpretations of moral principles. In this way, belief begins to evolve rather than disappear. Faith becomes less about accepting every detail as factual and more about finding meaning in the traditions and values the religion represents. For many people, this balance works surprisingly well. It allows them to maintain connection with their community while making space for the questions that have emerged. Humans are remarkably skilled at adapting meaning when old explanations begin to feel incomplete. But whether someone ultimately keeps their faith, reshapes it, or eventually walks away from it, one truth tends to remain constant. The moment you start questioning, something shifts inside your understanding of the world. And once that shift begins, everything starts to look a little different. Doubt is often portrayed as a failure, a weakness, even a moral flaw. Yet history tells a very different story. Many of the greatest turning points in human thought began with someone asking a question others were afraid to ask. Nearly every philosophical breakthrough started with doubt. Every scientific discovery began when someone looked at the accepted explanation and wondered if it might be incomplete. Even major religious reformations began with a quiet but unsettling thought. What if we are wrong about this? So, perhaps the real story is not about believers losing faith. Perhaps it is about human beings growing, learning, and exploring ideas more deeply than before. Because the moment you stop fearing questions, something remarkable happens. Thinking becomes possible again. And whether someone keeps their belief, reshapes it, or eventually walks away from it, the process almost always begins the same way. A single thought, a quiet moment of curiosity. And the moment you start questioning, everything changes. If you have ever experienced that moment, write, "I started questioning" in the comments. And if you value curiosity, psychology, and the deeper exploration of belief, subscribe. Some of the most important truths in life begin with the questions we were told never to ask.